Hey there, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most satisfying underdog stories in American business history. Picture this. It's 1947, and John Deere unveils a revolutionary new tractor. Their competitors take one look at it and literally laugh. They mock it in their marketing, they call it a toy. They tell farmers it'll never work. 2 years later, John Deere is outselling those same competitors 10 to 1. If you love stories about innovation, grit, and proving the doubters wrong, you're going to want to stick around for this one. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we bring you fascinating business stories like this every single week. So let's set the stage. World War II has just ended. American agriculture is at a crossroads. For decades, farmers had been using these massive, heavy tractors. We're talking machines that weighed several tons, had steel wheels, and were about as maneuverable as a freight train. These beasts were powerful, sure, but they had serious problems. They compacted the soil something fierce, which hurt crop yields. They were expensive to buy and expensive to run. They required multiple people to operate effectively, and they were slow, ridiculously slow. But this was just how things were done. The major manufacturers, International Harvester, Case, Massey Harris, they all made essentially the same type of tractor. Heavy, powerful, expensive. It was the industry standard, and nobody was really questioning it. Enter John Deere. Now, John Deere wasn't some scrappy startup. They'd been around since 1837, making plows and farm equipment. But in the tractor game, they were trailing behind. An International Harvester was the giant, absolutely dominating the market. John Deere knew they couldn't just make another heavy tractor and expect to compete. They needed something different, something radical. So they took a gamble that would either revolutionize farming or bankrupt the company. They assigned a team of engineers led by a brilliant guy named Henry Dreyfuss, an industrial designer, to reimagine what a tractor could be. Not just improve the existing design, but start from scratch. What do farmers actually need? What are the real problems they face every day? The team spent months talking to farmers, watching them work, understanding their frustrations. And what they found was fascinating. Farmers didn't actually need these massive, overpowered machines for most of their work. What they needed was versatility, efficiency, and ease of use. They needed something that one person could operate comfortably, something nimble enough to work smaller fields in tight spaces, something that wouldn't destroy their soil, something they could actually afford. So the team went to work. They designed something completely different from anything else on the market. It was smaller, significantly lighter, had a tricycle-style front end for better maneuverability, and it was mounted on rubber tires instead of steel wheels. The operator sat in a carefully designed seat with controls that one person could easily manage. They streamlined everything, making it simpler to maintain and repair. And here's the kicker. They made it affordable. This wasn't a tractor just for massive commercial farms. This was a tractor that regular family farmers could actually buy. In 1947, John Deere unveiled the Model M, and the reaction from their competitors was swift and brutal. They absolutely tore it apart. International Harvester representatives allegedly called it a toy tractor. Case salesmen told farmers it was too light to do real work. Massey Harris dealers claimed it would never hold up under serious farming conditions. The mockery wasn't just behind closed doors either. Competitors referenced it in their advertising, making thinly veiled comparisons between their serious, heavy-duty machines and these newfangled, lightweight contraptions. Industry publications were skeptical. Trade show attendees chuckled when they walked past the John Deere booth. The conventional wisdom was clear. John Deere had made a terrible mistake. They'd misread the market. Farmers wanted power, not some dinky little machine that looked like it belonged in a garden. But John Deere had done their homework. They knew something their competitors didn't. They'd actually listened to farmers instead of assuming they knew what farmers wanted. So, while their competitors laughed, John Deere doubled down. They launched an aggressive marketing campaign, but it wasn't your typical advertising. They didn't just put up billboards and take out magazine ads. They brought the tractors directly to farms. They offered test drives. They said, "Don't listen to us or our competitors. Try it yourself and see." And when farmers actually got on these tractors and used them, something magical happened. They realized this thing could do everything their old tractor could do, but better. It could plow, it could plant, it could cultivate. But it could also do things the heavy tractors couldn't. It could work between rows without damaging crops. It could turn on a dime in small fields. One person could operate it easily all day without exhaustion. It was faster, covering more ground in less time. The rubber tires meant less soil compaction and a smoother ride. Maintenance was simpler because the design was less complex. And the fuel efficiency was incredible compared to those gas-guzzling monsters from International Harvester and Case. Plus, and this was huge, it cost significantly less. A family farmer who could never afford one of those big expensive tractors could actually buy a Model M. Word started spreading. Farmer to farmer, county to county, state to state. Sales started climbing. But John Deere didn't stop with the Model M. They quickly followed up with the Model A, Model B, and Model G, each designed for different farming needs, but all following the same philosophy. Lighter, more efficient, more versatile, more affordable. They created an entire lineup based on this new approach. Meanwhile, their competitors were still churning out the same old heavy tractors, still convinced that their way was the right way. By 1949, just 2 years after that mocked debut, the numbers told an incredible story. John Deere wasn't just competing anymore, they were dominating. In some product categories, they were outselling their competitors 10 to 1. 10 to 1, let that sink in. The company that had been trailing behind, the tractor that had been called a toy, was now absolutely crushing it. Dealers who had been skeptical were now desperate to carry John Deere products, and farmers who had laughed were now trading in their old machines. And the competitors who had mocked them were now scrambling to copy their design. International Harvester, the former king of the industry, had to completely retool their production lines. Case had to go back to the drawing board. Massey Harris faced serious financial difficulties, partly because they'd been so slow to adapt. The entire industry had to pivot because John Deere had changed the game. And here's the beautiful irony. The things competitors had mocked, the lighter weight, the smaller size, the focus on efficiency over raw power, these became the new industry standards. Within a few years, everyone was making tractors that looked suspiciously similar to what John Deere had introduced in 1947. So what made this turnaround so dramatic? Well, why did John Deere succeed so spectacularly while their competitors floundered? First, they focused on the customer, not the competition. While other companies were obsessing over horsepower specs and trying to outdo each other with bigger machines, John Deere actually asked farmers what they needed. They didn't assume they knew better than their customers. They listened, observed, and designed solutions for real problems. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. Second, they had the courage to be different. John Deere could have played it safe. They could have made another conventional tractor, maybe slightly improved, and hoped to gradually gain market share. Instead, they took a massive risk. They designed something that looked nothing like the industry standard. They knew they'd face criticism and skepticism, but they believed in their research and their product. That takes guts, especially when you're not the market leader. Third, they let the product speak for itself. When competitors attacked them, John Deere didn't get into mudslinging matches or defensive advertising. They just said, try it. They knew that once farmers actually used these tractors, the benefits would be obvious. They had confidence that the product would win people over. And they were right. The test drive strategy was brilliant because it removed all the noise and let farmers make up their own minds based on actual experience. Fourth, they moved fast. After the initial success of the Model M, they didn't rest. They rapidly expanded the product line, making sure they had options for different types of farms and different needs. And they gave farmers choices within their new system. This meant that once a farmer bought into the John Deere approach, they could stay within the brand as their needs evolved. It created loyalty and momentum. And fifth, they fundamentally understood that the market was changing. Post-war America was different. Farms were getting smaller on average as the population spread out. Family farms needed equipment that matched their scale and budget. The economy was shifting. The old model of huge, expensive equipment made sense in a different era, but the world had moved on. John Deere recognized this macro trend while their competitors were stuck in the past. There's also a psychological element here that's fascinating. When you're the underdog, when people are mocking you, you have a clarity of purpose that frontrunners often lack. But John Deere knew they had to be better, not just as good. They couldn't afford to be complacent. Meanwhile, International Harvester and the others had gotten comfortable. They'd been successful for so long that they assumed they understood the market better than anyone. They dismissed John Deere's approach without seriously considering it. That arrogance cost them dearly. The story also highlights the danger of groupthink in an industry. When all the major players are making essentially the same product, it creates a false sense that this must be the right approach. Everyone's doing it this way, so this must be correct. But sometimes entire industries can be wrong about what customers actually want. It takes an outsider perspective, or at least someone willing to question assumptions, but to break through that groupthink and find a better way. For John Deere, this wasn't just a product success, it transformed the entire company. They went from being a secondary player in tractors to becoming the dominant force in American agriculture. That position they earned in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they've largely maintained it to this day. John Deere is synonymous with farming equipment now, and it all traces back to this pivotal moment when they zigged while everyone else sagged. The competitive landscape never recovered. International Harvester, once the undisputed king, struggled for decades and eventually exited the agricultural equipment business entirely. Their farm equipment division was sold off in the 1980s. Case merged with another company to try to stay competitive. But the entire hierarchy of the industry was reshuffled because of what happened in those 2 years from 1947 to 1949. And think about the farmers in all this. The ones who took a chance on that mocked little tractor when everyone was telling them to stick with the conventional machines. They got better equipment, saved money, improved their productivity, and probably had a lot of satisfaction telling their neighbors, "I told you so," as John Deere's success became undeniable. Early adopters always take a risk, but when they're right, the payoff isn't just financial. There's a vindication that comes with backing the right horse when everyone else is going the other direction. This story has lessons that apply way beyond tractors and farming. How many times have you seen a new product or idea get mocked, only to completely dominate later? The iPhone was famously dismissed by competitors. Netflix was laughed at by Blockbuster. Tesla was ridiculed by traditional automakers. The pattern repeats over and over. Incumbents get comfortable, a challenger does something radically different, the establishment mocks it, and then suddenly the world has changed, and the mocker becomes the mocked body. The key is distinguishing between ideas that are genuinely bad and ideas that are just different. John Deere's tractor wasn't a worse version of existing products. It was a fundamentally different approach based on different assumptions about what mattered. When competitors called it a toy, they were measuring it against the wrong criteria. They were judging it by weight and size when they should have been judging it by efficiency and versatility. They were fighting the last war instead of recognizing that the battlefield had changed. There's also something to be said about organizational culture here. John Deere had to have a culture that permitted this kind of radical thinking. Somebody had to approve the budget for this project knowing it would be controversial. Engineers had to feel empowered to challenge industry norms. The company had to resist the pressure to conform when competitors and even some dealers were critical. That takes strong leadership and a culture that values innovation over safety. It's easy to say companies should innovate, but it's much harder to support innovation when it's actually happening and looks risky and weird. Looking back now, it seems obvious that lighter, more efficient tractors were the future. But that's hindsight bias. In 1947, it wasn't obvious at all. The entire industry disagreed. Experts disagreed. The conventional wisdom was on the side of John Deere's competitors. It would have been so easy for John Deere to second-guess themselves, to dial back the radical elements, to make something more conventional. But they stuck to their guns, and that conviction made all the difference. So what's the takeaway from all this? If you're building something, creating something, trying to compete in any field, don't just look at what your competitors are doing and try to do it slightly better. Look at what customers actually need. Be willing to question assumptions that everyone takes for granted. Have the courage to be different even when people laugh. Let your work speak for itself rather than getting defensive. Move quickly when you find something that works, and understand the broader context and trends that might make old approaches obsolete. The 1947 John Deere Model M is a reminder that industries can be disrupted, that underdogs can win, and that sometimes the people laughing the loudest end up eating the most humble pie. 2 years from mockery to market domination. That's not just a business success story, that's a testament to the power of listening, innovating, and having the guts to stand by your convictions when the whole world is telling you you're wrong. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more fascinating tales from business history. What other underdog success stories would you like to hear about? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. See you in the next one. But here's something else worth considering. That the John Deere story also reveals how customer feedback loops work in real innovation. Henry Dreyfuss and his team didn't just send out surveys. They went into the field literally. They watched farmers work from dawn until dusk. They noticed small details that farmers themselves might not have even consciously articulated. Like how much a farmer's back hurt after a full day on the old machines. How difficult it was to make precise turns. How muddy and slippery the steel wheels became in certain conditions. These weren't things farmers would necessarily list as top complaints, but they were real problems that affected daily life and productivity. By observing, rather than just asking, John Deere uncovered needs that competitors never even thought to address. This approach to design thinking was decades ahead of its time. So we talk about user experience and empathy in product design like it's a modern concept, but John Deere was doing it in the 1940s. They understood that great products come from genuinely understanding how people live and work, not from engineers sitting in conference rooms theorizing about what people probably want. That empathetic approach to problem solving is something that applies whether you're designing tractors or software or furniture or anything else. There's also an interesting lesson about manufacturing and scale here. Once John Deere's designs started selling, the company had to ramp up production dramatically. Within a short period, they went from making relatively few tractors to needing to produce them at volumes they'd never attempted before. This could have been a massive problem. Factories would need retooling. Supply chains would need to expand. Quality could have suffered if they weren't careful. But John Deere managed this transition successfully, which speaks to the quality of their operations team. Innovation is great, but you also need execution excellence to turn that innovation into a market victory. The dealer network was critical too. Once farmers started wanting John Deere products, the company needed dealers everywhere to sell and service them. But John Deere had to convince dealers to take a chance on what the established players were calling inferior products. Many dealers were originally skeptical and cautious. Convincing them required not just showing sales numbers, but building a partnership where dealers felt supported and confident. John Deere offered training, provided good margins, and stood behind their products. While the relationship between manufacturer and dealer became a competitive advantage that competitors couldn't easily replicate. If you zoom out further, there's a fascinating historical context too. The post-war period was about democratization in America. More people were moving to suburbs. Consumer goods were becoming more accessible to regular working people, not just the wealthy. There was an expectation that products should be practical, efficient, and affordable. The old, expensive, heavy tractor model belonged to an older era when farming was concentrated among fewer, larger landholders. The new post-war America needed equipment that matched a new reality. John Deere understood this zeitgeist intuitively, while their competitors were still living in the pre-war mindset. Being in tune with your era is something successful companies often do without even fully realizing it. The marketing strategy deserves more emphasis too. John Deere essentially invented the test drive promotional approach in agricultural equipment. They didn't just hope dealers would figure this out. The company actively encouraged and supported direct customer trials. They'd bring machines to county fairs. They'd loan tractors to influential farmers who could then demonstrate them to their neighbors. They understood that seeing was believing, and they made it easy for skeptics to become converts through hands-on experience. This was so effective that it became a playbook other industries started copying. There's also something quietly important about company loyalty and institutional memory. John Deere had been making farm equipment since 1837. They had deep relationships with farmers. When a farmer trusted John Deere's plow, that trust carried forward. When the company said try this new tractor, some farmers gave them the benefit of the doubt simply because of decades of positive relationships. Meanwhile, some competitors were newer to the market or had damaged their reputations. That brand equity that John Deere had built up over a century gave them crucial credibility when they asked farmers to try something radically different. It's a reminder that a good reputation, built slowly over time, is incredibly valuable when you need people to take a risk on you. The story also illustrates an important principle about disruption. The disruption didn't come from outside the industry, it came from within, not from an established company doing something new. Sometimes the most dangerous competitors aren't startups trying to enter a market. They're existing players who decide to fundamentally rethink their approach. John Deere had capital, manufacturing expertise, dealer relationships, and brand recognition. They used all of that, but they combined it with fresh thinking and willingness to cannibalize their own previous products if necessary. They didn't say we've always made heavy tractors, so that's our identity. They said our identity is serving farmers, and here's a better way to do that. Speed of iteration is another element. After the Model M proved successful, John Deere didn't just make the same tractor over and over. They created variants, improved designs, expanded the product family. They were nimble and responsive to feedback. Now, if a design worked, they'd quickly expand on it. If something wasn't right, they'd improve it for the next generation. This rapid iteration created a moving target for competitors trying to catch up. By the time a competitor got their version of a lightweight tractor to market, John Deere was already on the next evolution. There's a human element worth exploring too. The engineers and designers at John Deere felt like they were part of something important. They weren't just making equipment. They were genuinely making farmers' lives better and easier. That sense of purpose, that feeling that your work matters, tends to unleash creativity and effort that no amount of compensation or pressure can force. When your team believes they're doing something meaningful, and when they see that meaning validated by market success, you get a level of engagement and innovation that becomes self-sustaining. You could also look at this from an economic perspective. John Deere expanded the tractor market significantly. By making tractors more affordable and accessible, they brought equipment that had been out of reach for many family farms into the realm of possibility. This actually created new demand. Farmers who would never have bought a tractor at the old price point could now afford one. That expanded the total market, which actually benefited the whole industry, even though John Deere benefited most. Sometimes disruption isn't about taking market share from competitors so much as it's about expanding the total market in your favor. Looking at the psychology of the competing executives is interesting too. When you're the market leader, when you're successful, it's psychologically very difficult to acknowledge that someone else might have a better idea. There's confirmation bias. You remember all the reasons you do things the way you do them. You notice all the ways that the new approach might not work, while ignoring ways it could work. Your success becomes evidence that your approach is right, and anyone doing it differently must be wrong. That psychological trap is probably the single biggest factor that allows disruptors to succeed against entrenched incumbents. The sustainability of John Deere's advantage is also worth considering. Some disruptions are fleeting. A company comes up with something clever, enjoys a few years of dominance, and then fades. John Deere didn't fade. The company maintained and extended its market leadership for decades. This is because they didn't just have one good product. They had a system, a philosophy, a commitment to continuous improvement and customer focus that sustained their advantage long-term. Once farmers switched to John Deere, they tended to stay with John Deere because the company kept innovating and improving. That switching cost, that loyalty, is what created a durable competitive advantage. There's also something to learn about timing and luck. Would John Deere's new approach have succeeded in 1937? Probably not. The economic and social conditions weren't right. The market still worked differently. You can't separate great strategy from good timing. John Deere was bold enough to create the new tractors, but they were also lucky enough that they did it at exactly the right historical moment. That's not to diminish their achievement, but to acknowledge that success is often a combination of smart choices and favorable circumstances converging. The role of communication deserves mention too. When you're after introducing something radically new, communication becomes critical. You can't just let the product sit in a factory hoping people will discover it. You need to tell a compelling story about why this matters, why it's different, why people should care. John Deere did this brilliantly through dealer communications, through advertising, through demonstrations, through word of mouth. They made the case for why the future of farming should look different from the past. As we reflect on this story today, in an era of constant innovation and rapid change, the John Deere moment feels both timeless and urgent. We live in a world where disruption has become expected, but where companies are always trying to be the next John Deere, always looking for that breakthrough innovation that transforms their industry. But there are still lessons here that don't change. Listen to your customers deeply. Be willing to question assumptions everyone takes for granted. Have conviction even when others doubt. Execute brilliantly, and recognize that the future belongs to those who understand where the world is heading, not just where it's been.